Sam Querrey is going off right now. And when someone like Sam Querrey starts talking, the tennis world listens, because this is not just any voice throwing opinions around on the internet. This is a man who spent years competing at the highest level of professional tennis, who understands the sport from the inside out, who knows what real star power looks like when it walks into a room. And right now, Sam Querrey is pointing at one person and one person only. He is pointing at Eala, and he is saying without any hesitation whatsoever that she has become the single biggest draw heading into the upcoming WTA tournaments. Not one of the biggest, not among the biggest, full stop. And Querrey is not whispering this in a corner somewhere hoping nobody notices. He is going all out, he is putting it on the table in front of everyone and daring anyone to challenge it. He is declaring that Eala has reached a level of drawing power that puts her above the entire field in terms of the attention and electricity she generates every single time she steps onto a court. And if that was not already bold enough, Querrey and the group of experts rallying around this conversation are taking it one step further. They are saying Eala is on a trajectory to surpass even Aryna Sabalenka herself when it comes to pulling people in. Think about what that means for a moment. Sabalenka is the world #1. She is a multiple Grand Slam champion. She is one of the most dominant and recognizable players on the planet right now. And these experts are looking at the landscape and concluding that when it comes to filling stadiums, generating that electric atmosphere, and making people feel like they absolutely cannot miss a match, Eala is already doing it at a higher level. That is not a small claim. That is one of the boldest declarations anyone has made about a player in women's tennis in years. Querrey made his position clear during a conversation on the Nothing Major podcast alongside fellow former ATP professionals Steve Johnson and John Isner, three men who spent their careers at the top of professional tennis and who understand the sport's commercial and emotional landscape better than most people alive. The exchange was direct, fast, and completely unambiguous. Querrey asked the group point blank whether Eala was now the biggest draw in women's tennis in the entire world. He followed it immediately by asking whether she was bigger than Sabalenka and bigger than Coco Gauff, two names that until very recently were considered completely untouchable when it came to star power on the women's tour. Steve Johnson answered without a moment's hesitation. He said yes, and then he reached for the most relevant comparison available, what Brazilian teenager João Fonseca did to the men's side of the game last year in Miami, when his matches had to be physically relocated because the crowd showing up to watch him was simply too large for the courts originally scheduled. Johnson said the Eala effect is comparable to that. He paused. Then he said he actually thinks it might already be bigger. John Isner nodded immediately and brought up the scenes in Doha the previous week where the crowds turning out for Eala's matches were, in his exact words, insane. Not impressive, not notable, insane. These are not men prone to exaggeration. These are professionals who spent decades inside the sport. When they use language like that, it means something real is happening. And the evidence backing up every word they said is overwhelming. Querrey's argument is not built on speculation or wishful thinking. It is built on what is actually happening at these tournaments in real time. The numbers do not lie, the crowds do not lie. When Eala is scheduled to play, something shifts in the air around that event. People who had no plans to attend suddenly find themselves trying to get tickets. Fans who already have tickets start talking about the match days in advance. And people travel from extraordinary distances, from across continents, from the other side of the world, just to be in the same building as this young woman from the Philippines and watch her compete. At the Australian Open earlier this year, something happened at Court 6 that tournament officials had not fully anticipated. Hundreds of Filipino fans descended on that court for Eala's first-round match. Not dozens, hundreds. The court could not hold them. Security had to turn people away at the entrance while others crowded around big screens gathered in food courts nearby and climbed to any elevated position they could find just to catch a glimpse through the stands. The chair umpire repeatedly asked the crowd to settle during points because the noise level was unlike anything normally heard in that part of the grounds. That is not something you manufacture. That is people feeling something deeply and responding in the most direct way possible. The press conference numbers told an even sharper story. Before the tournament had even begun, Eala's pre-tournament press conference attracted approximately 171,000 viewers online. Carlos Alcaraz, one of the most famous and celebrated young men's players in the world right now, drew around 29,000. Coco Gauff drew a similar number. Aryna Sabalenka, the reigning world #1, drew approximately 9,000. 9,000 compared to 171,000. Those numbers do not represent a fluke. They represent a signal so clear and so loud that only someone actively trying to ignore it could miss what it is saying. And at every tournament Eala enters, the story is the same. The scheduling decisions are being affected by her presence. Tournament directors are having conversations about which court to put her on, because anything smaller than center court creates a crowd management problem. Krish made this point directly. He said that even though Eala is not yet in the top 10 in the world rankings, organizers have reached a point where they simply have to schedule her on the biggest available venue when she plays. That is an operational reality. That is not hype. That is tournament logistics being reorganized around the existence of one player. Querrey. then raised a point that landed with considerable weight and generated a lot of reaction from everyone in the conversation. He wondered aloud whether some of the top-ranked women on the WTA tour might be feeling a certain kind of way about all of this. He mentioned players like Sabalenka, women who have worked their entire lives to reach the absolute pinnacle of the sport, who have won the biggest titles the game has to offer, and suggested that watching the wave of attention and atmosphere following Eala around might be something they have noticed and cannot easily ignore. He raised the idea that there might be some jealousy there, that watching a player not yet in the top 30 of the world rankings generate more passion, more noise, and more electricity in a stadium than you do despite being the world #1 is not a comfortable thing to witness. Isner pushed back on this somewhat, suggesting it is simply part of the natural dynamics of the sport and that great players have always understood and accepted those dynamics. But the question itself was the most important thing, because it pointed directly at the core tension running through this entire conversation, the growing gap between what the rankings say about a player's importance and what the crowds are actually demonstrating about who they want to watch. Those two things are telling different stories right now, and Querrey is not the only one noticing it. Jessica Pegula came forward with something even more powerful than analysis because she brought personal experience. Pegula is not a commentator or a pundit. She is a top competitor who has spent years at the highest level of the WTA Tour. She walked into a match against Eala at the Miami Open and described what she found waiting for her inside that stadium as genuinely astonishing. She said she had not expected it. She had not prepared herself for the scale of the crowd or the intensity of the energy in the building. She used the word insane and meant it entirely without complaint or qualification. She was marveling at what she had witnessed from inside the experience of being the opponent on the other side of the net. And Pegula went further, making a point that was specific and striking. She said that whether it was Miami, the Australian Open, or Dubai, Alexandra Eala has consistently generated the biggest crowd support of any player on the entire tour. Not occasionally, consistently. Tournament after tournament, continent after continent, the scenes are the same. People show up in numbers that no other player is currently producing. People travel for her. People wait in lines far longer than any normal match would generate, just for the chance to be inside the stadium and witness what happens when she plays. Pegula also acknowledged something important about the Australian Open specifically, that Eala was placed on a court that was simply too small for the crowd she drew, and that the overflow created situations the tournament had not fully planned for. That is not a criticism of Eala. That is an acknowledgement that the sport is still catching up to the scale of what she represents. And then Novak Djokovic added his voice to everything already being said, and when Djokovic speaks, the dimension of the conversation changes entirely. The man with more Grand Slam singles titles than anyone in the history of professional tennis stepped forward and called Alexandra Eala the greatest tennis player the Philippines has ever produced. He said she deserves every bit of respect and recognition the sport can give her. And he spoke specifically about the way her scheduling and court assignments have been managed at certain tournaments, making clear that he believes the situation has not always been handled in a way that properly reflects her actual status and drawing power. He suggested, carefully but unmistakably, that tournament organizers have sometimes placed her on courts that were too small for the crowd she brings, and that this represents a failure of judgment on the part of those making the decisions. When the greatest player in the history of the sport stands up and says that a 22-year-old from the Philippines deserves better treatment from the tennis establishment needs to sit down and listen carefully. This is no longer fans making noise on social media. This is the greatest of all time, lending his voice and his credibility to the same conclusion that Querrey, Johnson, Isner and Pegula had already reached from their own angles. Alexandra Eala is not being treated with the weight that her actual drawing power demands, and the people who have seen the most of this sport's history are saying so out loud. The broader group of analysts and experts surrounding this conversation have arrived at one more conclusion that deserves to be taken seriously because it speaks to where all of this is heading. They are arguing that if Alexandra Eala wins a Grand Slam title in 26, it would be one of the single biggest moments in professional tennis in recent memory. Not just for the Philippines, not just for Asian tennis, for the entire sport globally. They are saying it would be the kind of milestone that rewrites narratives and creates a whole new generation of fans who point to that moment and say that is when everything changed. The kind of event that a sport only gets to experience a handful of times across an entire generation. That is an enormous statement. And the fact that respected, experienced, credible voices in the tennis world are making it tells you everything about how seriously Eala's potential is being taken right now. Because it is not wishful thinking, it is extrapolation from a pattern that is already established, already verified, and already accelerating. She has beaten Grand Slam champions. She has made quarterfinals at WTA 1000 events. She has climbed from 140th in the world to a career high of 31 in the space of roughly 12 months. And at every single stop along the way, the crowd scenes have been unlike anything else happening in women's tennis. The analysts are drawing a clear distinction that ties all of this together. Nobody is diminishing what Aryna Sabalenka has accomplished inside the lines. She is a champion of the highest order and one of the best players of her generation. But there is a difference between winning titles and having the kind of cultural and commercial impact that transforms a sport and opens it to entirely new audiences around the world. On the inside the lines measure, Sabalenka sits at the very top. On the cultural impact measure, on the drawing power measure, on the crowd magnetism measure, on the ability to make millions of people who had no prior relationship with professional tennis suddenly feel like they need to watch a match. The analysts are saying Eala stands alone right now. She is doing something the sport has been trying to manufacture in new markets for years, and she is doing it not through any marketing campaign or manufactured narrative, but purely through the force of her talent, the power of her story, and the genuine emotional connection between her and the communities around the world that see themselves in her. Sam Querrey started this conversation, but it has grown far beyond one man's opinion on one podcast. The players are saying it, the legends are saying it, the experts are saying it, and the crowds showing up in extraordinary numbers everywhere. Eala players are saying it louder than all of them combined. The biggest draw in women's tennis, that is what she has become. And everything unfolding around her right now makes one thing absolutely clear: this is only the beginning. If this conversation has you fired up, drop your take in the comments right now. Do you think Eala is genuinely the biggest draw in women's tennis today? Is she going to win a Grand Slam before this year is out? We want every opinion, every prediction, and every argument you are bringing to this debate. Hit that like button because this story deserves to reach every single tennis fan who has not yet realized what is happening with Eala. Subscribe to this channel because we are covering every chapter of this rise in real time with the depth it deserves. The most compelling story in women's tennis right now is happening in front of our eyes. Do not miss a single moment of it.